But the 30s started on a sour note. The strikes of the 1920s had foreshadowed growing social unrest, and the Wall Street crash had heralded the Great Depression, which was to dominate the early years of the decade. On the railways, there was a downturn in business, which was to result in the laying up of many locomotives. However, this coincided with a time when many locomotives were due for replacement in any event. The golden era of the late Victorian and early Edwardian times having produced a large stock of locomotives reaching the end of their economic lives by the beginning of the 30s. On no railway was this more apparent than on the Great Western Railway. The abolition of the broad gauge in 1892 and the consequent re-equipping of the locomotive stock which had taken place under Dean and Churchwood had resulted in a requirement to rebuild or replace many different types of engine. In addition, the locomotives of the various smaller companies absorbed by the GWR in the 1923 grouping were deemed non-standard, whilst changed operating requirements, allied to improvements to the infrastructure, meant that larger locomotives could be employed. Under Churchwood, the GWR was amongst the first to embrace wholehearted standardization, and its unique position amongst the Big Four, effectively untouched by the grouping, meant that this policy could be continued unchanged by his successor Charles Collett. This had already become obvious at the end of the 20s, when the first generation Churchwood engines, now over a quarter of a century old, became due for replacement. The counties and county tanks could be replaced by 6-coupled machines, and were to be seen on Swindon's famous dump alongside the products of the Dean era, with their double frames and enormous domes. The Churchwood boilers of the double-framed Cities, Atbaras and Bulldogs could yield reusable standard fittings for further use, but these tanks of the Welsh-absorbed companies would go forever. Churchwood's own 242 tanks had been superseded by 262s, and double frames abandoned for new construction in the first decade of the century. One style of locomotive, the 042 tank, epitomized by the 517 class, had no suitable replacement design, so new locomotives, the 4800 class, were built to what was effectively the same design. The South Wales tanks had already been replaced by the 5600s.